The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the city as I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart racing with anticipation. My name is Lauren, and this story is something I never thought I'd have to tell. I was 22 when I met David, my boyfriend, who was charming, kind, and everything I thought I wanted. But it wasn't him who consumed my thoughts every night. It was his father, Robert. It all started innocently enough. David invited me over for dinner to meet his family. I remember walking into their beautiful suburban home, the kind you see in magazines. Robert was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine, and when he turned to greet me, something shifted in the air. He was tall, with a distinguished look, salt and pepper hair, a strong jawline, and eyes that held a depth I couldn't ignore. He looked at me in a way no one ever had before, and I felt a thrill rush through me that I couldn't explain. The dinner was normal, filled with polite conversation and laughter, but I couldn't stop stealing glances at Robert. Every time our eyes met, it felt like a spark igniting something forbidden. As the night ended and David drove me home, I found myself replaying every moment in my head, not thinking about my boyfriend, but about his father. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time at David's house, and every time, the tension between Robert and me grew stronger. It was a simple touch of his hand as he passed me a plate, or the way his gaze lingered a second too long. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but I couldn't help myself. I felt alive in a way I never had before. One evening, David was running late, stuck at work. I arrived at their house early, expecting to wait alone. Instead, I found Robert sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up, surprised to see me. "David's not home yet," he said, his voice smooth and deep, sending a shiver down my spine. "But you're welcome to wait." I nodded, feeling a flush of heat rise to my cheeks as I took a seat across from him. We sat there in silence for a moment, the only sound the ice clinking in his glass. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You know, Lauren," he started, his eyes locking onto mine, "I can't help but notice the way you look at me." I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was like he had reached inside my mind and pulled out the secret I'd been trying so hard to hide. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but instead, I found myself leaning forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "And how do I look at you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he set his glass down and crossed the room in a few swift strides, stopping right in front of me. He reached out, cupping my chin gently in his hand, forcing me to look up at him. "Like you want me," he said, his voice low and filled with an intensity that made my pulse race. I knew it was wrong. This was my boyfriend's father, a man twice my age. But the desire burning inside me drowned out every rational thought. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss filled with every ounce of forbidden longing I'd been holding back, and when he kissed me back, I felt like I was on fire. We pulled away, both of us breathless, staring at each other like we couldn't believe what we had just done. "This can't happen," I whispered, even as my body leaned into his. "But it already has," he replied, his thumb brushing over my lower lip, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. From that moment on, there was no turning back. Whenever David wasn't around, Robert and I found ourselves drawn to each other like magnets. It wasn't just physical. It was an emotional connection I couldn't deny. He understood me in a way no one else did, and being with him made me feel seen, alive. One night, as I lay in bed with David asleep beside me, I received a text from Robert. "Meet me downstairs." My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake David. I crept down the stairs, finding Robert waiting for me in the darkened kitchen. He pulled me into his arms without a word, kissing me like he'd been starved for me. It was thrilling and terrifying, knowing that we could get caught at any moment. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered against his lips, even as my hands tangled in his hair. "I know," he replied, but he didn't let go. "But I can't stay away from you." The guilt was crushing me, but the desire was stronger. We made love right there, quietly, desperately, as if we were the only two people in the world. When it was over, we stood there, clinging to each other, both knowing that what we were doing was wrong, but unable to stop. The next morning, I sat across from David at breakfast, pretending like nothing had happened. Robert walked in, his expression calm and composed, but when our eyes met, a secret smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was our little game, our dangerous secret, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. But secrets like this can't stay hidden forever. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled, before the lies and betrayal came crashing down around us. And when it did, there would be no escaping the fallout. This is where the story really begins. And trust me, it only gets more twisted from here. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen glances, secret texts, and quiet meetings behind closed doors. Every moment with Robert was filled with an intensity that I couldn't find with anyone else, not even David. It was like he could see right through me, know every thought before I had it, and it terrified me how easily I fell under his spell. One Sunday afternoon, David had gone out to play basketball with his friends. I was left alone in the house with Robert. He was in the backyard, fixing the pool filter, his shirt off, sweat glistening on his toned, sun-kissed skin. I watched him from the kitchen window, feeling a heat rise inside me that had nothing to do with the weather. I knew I shouldn't go out there. I should stay inside, keep my distance and pretend that nothing had ever happened between us, but the pull was too strong, like a current dragging me under, no matter how hard I fought against it. I stepped outside, the sun warm on my skin, the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. He glanced up as I approached, a knowing smile curving his lips. "Need some help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. He chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You planning on fixing the pool filter in that dress?" I glanced down, realizing I'd thrown on a short sundress, one that clung to my curves in all the right places. I felt a flush creep up my neck, but I didn't turn away. Instead, I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You look tense," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe I can help you relax." He didn't say a word, just took my hand and pulled me into the pool house, away from prying eyes. The moment the door closed behind us, he was on me, his mouth crashing against mine in a kiss that was all teeth and tongue and pent-up desire. I moaned into his mouth, feeling his hands roam over my body, pulling me closer, like he couldn't get enough. "Lauren," he groaned, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes. "This is dangerous. We need to stop." But even as he said it, his hands didn't leave my hips. He was gripping me like he was afraid to let go. "I don't want to stop," I breathed, my hands sliding up his chest. "I want you." His eyes darkened, the last shred of hesitation slipping away. He lifted me onto the counter, his hands gripping my thighs as he kissed me again, deeper this time, like he was trying to consume me. It was reckless and wild, but I didn't care. I needed him like I needed air. We didn't hear the front door open. We didn't hear David's footsteps as he walked into the backyard calling my name. It wasn't until I heard his voice, closer this time, that the reality of what we were doing crashed over me like a wave. "Lauren?" David's voice was filled with confusion and concern. I shoved Robert away, scrambling off the counter, my heart in my throat. He looked just as panicked as I felt, his eyes wide, his breathing ragged. "Stay here," he whispered urgently. "I'll handle it." I nodded, too afraid to speak, afraid that my voice would betray me. I watched him step outside, pulling the door shut behind him, blocking me from David's view. "What's going on, Dad?" I heard David ask, his voice closer now, filled with suspicion. "Nothing," Robert replied smoothly. "Just fixing the filter." Lauren was helping me, but she went inside. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the adrenaline making my hands shake. If David found out what was really happening, everything would be ruined. "Is she okay?" David sounded worried now, like he could sense that something was off. "She's fine," Robert assured him. "Probably just needed a moment to cool off. It's hot out here." The door opened and Robert slipped back inside, closing it behind him. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of relief and something else, something darker, like excitement. "That was close," he whispered, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair behind my ear. I slapped his hand away, the panic turning into anger. "What are we doing?" I hissed. "This is insane. We're going to get caught." He grabbed my wrist, pulling me against him, his eyes burning into mine. "I don't care," he said fiercely. "I can't stop, and I know you don't want to either." He was right. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't pull away. I was trapped in this twisted, dangerous game we were playing, and I didn't know how to get out. The days that followed were filled with tension. I could barely look David in the eye, terrified that he'd see the guilt written all over my face. But he seemed oblivious, sweet and loving as always, making the betrayal cut even deeper. Robert, on the other hand, was relentless. He found every excuse to touch me, to whisper in my ear when no one was looking. It was like a drug, and I was addicted. I knew it couldn't last, but I couldn't bring myself to end it. One evening, David had to work late, and I found myself alone with Robert again. He cornered me in the kitchen, pressing me against the counter, his hands sliding under my dress. "You're mine," he growled against my ear. "No one else can have you." A thrill shot through me at his possessive words, even though I knew it was wrong. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer. "What if he finds out?" I whispered, my voice filled with both fear and excitement. "He won't," Robert promised, his lips trailing down my neck. "Not if we're careful." But we weren't careful. We were reckless, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. It was a Sunday morning when the truth finally came out. David had left his phone on the kitchen counter, and a text from Robert popped up on the screen. I saw it before I could look away. "Can't wait to see you tonight." David picked up his phone, frowning at the message. He looked up at me, confusion and hurt in his eyes. "Why is my dad texting you like this?" he asked, his voice trembling. My heart sank. There was no going back now. David's eyes bored into mine, the message still open on his phone. A look of betrayal I'd never seen before etched across his face. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I tried to find the words, but my throat was dry, and my heart pounded in my chest. "David," I began, stepping towards him, but he backed away, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why is my dad texting you like this, Lauren?" The room felt like it was spinning spinning, my vision blurring as panic set in. I opened my mouth to speak, to try to explain, but nothing came out. It was like I was frozen in place, caught in the act with no way to hide. Just then, the front door creaked open and Robert walked in, his usual confident stride faltering when he saw us standing there. He took one look at David's face, then glanced at the phone in his hand, and I saw the color drain from his cheeks. "Dad?" David's voice was hollow, filled with disbelief. "What's going on here?" Robert's eyes flicked to mine, searching for an answer, but I was just as lost as he was. He took a step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "David, listen," he started, his voice calm, too calm. "It's not what you think, but that was a lie, and we all knew it. Don't lie to me," David snapped, his voice rising in anger. "I'm not an idiot. I can see what's been going on. How long has this been happening?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and fury. "How long, Lauren?" I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, trapping me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I glanced at Robert, hoping he'd have something to say, a way to fix this, but he just stood there, silent, the guilt written all over his face. "It's true," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, David. I never meant for this to happen." "You never meant for this to happen?" David's laugh was cold, devoid of any humor. "You've been sleeping with my father, and you never meant for it to happen?" Robert stepped forward, reaching out to his son, but David recoiled as if he'd been burned. "Don't touch me," he spat. "You're both disgusting." The silence that followed was suffocating. I wanted to say something, to explain, but what could I say? That I was weak? That I'd been caught up in something I couldn't control? It all sounded like excuses, and I knew it. "You were my family," David said, his voice cracking as tears welled up in his eyes. "I loved you, Lauren. And you—" He turned to Robert, his face twisted with pain. "You were supposed to be my father." Robert's face crumpled, the mask of calm slipping away as he realized the full weight of what he'd done. "David, please," he begged. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I love you. I never wanted to hurt you." David's laugh was harsh, filled with a bitterness that cut through the room like a knife. "A mistake?" he repeated. "This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice you both made, over and over again." He turned away, grabbing his car keys from the counter, his hands shaking. I stepped forward, reaching out to stop him. "David, please don't go," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. "We can fix this. We can figure it out." He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time, and the look on his face shattered whatever was left of my heart. "There's nothing left to fix," he said quietly. "You've destroyed everything." With that, he walked out the door, slamming it behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, my body racked with guilt and grief. Robert knelt beside me, his hand resting on my back, but his touch no longer brought me any comfort. "What have we done?" I whispered, my voice choked with tears. "We've made a mess," he replied, his voice hollow. "A mess we can never clean up." The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. David cut off all contact, moving out of the house and blocking my number. I heard from mutual friends that he had gone to stay with his mother, leaving us behind, like we were nothing but a bad memory. Robert and I tried to continue our relationship, clinging to each other in the aftermath of the disaster we'd created, but the guilt was too heavy, the shame too deep. Every time we touched, it felt like a reminder of everything we'd destroyed. One night, as we sat together in silence, Robert turned to me, his eyes filled with a sadness I'd never seen before. "This isn't working," he said softly. "We can't keep pretending like we can move on from this." I nodded, the tears welling up again. "I know," I whispered, "but I don't know how to let you go." He cupped my face in his hands, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "You have to," he murmured. "We both do. It's the only way we can start to heal." And so, we ended it. I moved out of the house, leaving behind the memories and the pain. It was like cutting out a piece of my heart, but I knew it was the only way. Years later, I heard that David had gotten married. He looked happy in the photos, his smile genuine, the light back in his eyes. I didn't reach out. I didn't want to disrupt the life he'd rebuilt, a life free from the chaos I'd brought into it. As for me, I've tried to move on, to find some semblance of peace. But there are nights when I lie awake, haunted by the memory of what we did, the choices we made, and the people we hurt. I've told this story not to ask for forgiveness, but because it's the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the only thing that can set us free. Maybe one day, I'll find a way to forgive myself. Until then, I carry the weight of this secret, a scar that will never fully heal.